Julian Thorne sat in the silence of his penthouse study. The city sprawled below, a tapestry of glittering lights and shadowed alleys. It was his city. He owned the glittering lights. He commanded the shadowed alleys. On his desk, a single glass of amber liquid sat untouched. His hands, thick with scars and experience, rested on the cool, dark wood of the desk. He was a man carved from consequence, his face a roadmap of hard decisions and harder victories. His gaze was fixed on the wall opposite him. Behind a bland, unassuming painting of a forgotten seascape was his true vault. Not the one in the bank, filled with paper and gold, but the one that held his life's tangible secrets. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, economical. Age had not softened him, it had distilled him to his most potent form. He moved the painting aside, the mechanism silent, well-oiled. The circular steel door of the safe was revealed, its dial gleaming faintly in the lamplight. He did not need the light. His fingers knew the numbers by heart. A birth date. A date of loss. A final, victorious number that had sealed his ascent. Click. Whir. Thud. The heavy door swung open. Inside were ledgers, deeds, and a single, velvet-lined box containing a watch he had taken from his father's wrist on the day of his burial. But he ignored all of it. His target was a small, hidden compartment at the very back, concealed by a false panel. He was so focused, so deep within the ritual, that he barely registered the soft footfalls behind him. A new girl. The agency had sent her. Young, quiet, efficient. He had seen her moving through the massive apartment like a ghost for the past week, always with her head down, her presence barely a whisper. He heard a faint gasp, then the soft clatter of a feather duster falling to the plush carpet. "I am sorry, sir," a small voice stammered. "I did not mean to disturb you. I will come back later." Julian did not turn. His eyes remained on the open safe. He merely raised a hand, a gesture that meant stay. It was a command few in his world would ever dare to disobey. He heard her freeze in place. His fingers found the edge of the false panel and slid it away. And there it was. A single, dog-eared photograph. Faded with time. A young woman with his eyes and his mother's smile stood on a PA, the wind catching her hair. Her name was Amelia. His sister. Around her neck, she wore a silver locket. Heart-shaped. Etched with a single, delicate rose. He had given it to her for her 16th birthday. A memory, sharp and painful, pierced the thick hide of his composure. He remembered her laughter that day. He remembered the promise he made to always look after her. A promise he had failed to keep. "Sir," the girl's voice trembled again, closer this time. She must have bent to retrieve her duster. "Please, I..." Her voice caught. It was the silence that made him turn. Not the words, but the sudden, sharp intake of breath. The complete cessation of sound. He turned his head slowly. The maid, Elena, was on her knees, her fallen duster forgotten. Her eyes were wide, fixed not on the contents of the safe, but on him. No, not on him. On something he was not yet seeing. Hanging from a thin chain around her own neck was a silver locket. It rested against the simple grey fabric of her uniform. Heart-shaped. Etched with a single, delicate rose. It was identical. Impossible. Time seemed to slow, the air in the room growing thick and heavy. His gaze flicked from the locket around her neck to the photograph of his sister still tucked away in the safe. The same design. The same faint tarnish of age. The same impossible object, existing in two places at once. His mind, a machine of logic and suspicion, began to whir. Coincidence was a luxury he did not believe in. In his world, there were only plans, betrayals, and consequences. The girl, Elena, saw the direction of his gaze. She saw the photograph. Her hand flew to the locket at her throat, a protective, instinctual gesture. Fear radiated from her. Not the fear of an employee who had overstepped, but a deeper, more profound terror. The fear of a cornered animal. Where did you get that? His voice was low, a rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the voice he used before things turned violent. She flinched, scrambling back a step. It was my mother's, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She gave it to me. Julian Thorne, a man who had not felt a tremor of personal fear in 30 years, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He took a step towards her, his mind racing faster than it ever had during a hostile takeover or a back-alley negotiation. The girl was a key. A key to a door he thought had been sealed and buried for decades. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will redefine the meaning of justice. Like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Julian's world operated on a set of rigid, unbreakable principles. Loyalty was paramount. Betrayal was a capital offense. And sentimentality was a weakness to be purged. He had built an empire on these tenets, a sprawling network of businesses, some legitimate, most not, all bound together by the force of his will and the certainty of his retribution. He was not a good man. He knew this. He had made peace with it long ago. Good men did not survive the world he had clawed his way through. Good men did not build dynasties from the rubble of their enemies. Good men had families that were safe, that were whole. His was not. The wound of his sister's disappearance had been the furnace in which his new life was forged. Amelia. She was 17, full of life and light, the polar opposite of his own brooding nature. She had vanished on a summer evening 35 years ago. No note. No witnesses. No body. The police had called it a runaway case. Julian knew better. He knew evil existed. He just hadn't had the power to fight it back then. He was 19, all fury and helplessness. He had searched, he had screamed, he had broken bones and bled for answers that never came. That failure, that utter powerlessness, had become the bedrock of his ambition. He swore he would never be weak again. He would become so powerful that the world itself would bend to his questions. And he had. He had built his throne, but the ghost of Amelia always sat beside him. The photograph was his only penance. A reminder of the one debt he could never repay. Now, this girl, this maid, stood in his study wearing a ghost's locket. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. She was young, perhaps 20. Thin, with the tired pallor of someone who worked too many hours for too little pay. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a familiar shade of hazel, wide and expressive, currently filled with a terror so pure it was almost paralyzing. They were his sister's eyes. The thought hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Leo," Julian said, his voice calm, but the command carried an edge of cold steel. His lieutenant, who had been standing sentinel by the door, stepped into the room. Leo was a large man, perpetually dressed in a sharp suit, his expression unreadable. He had been with Julian for 2 decades and had never seen his boss rattled. He saw it now. Leo's eyes flicked to the girl, then back to Julian, a question in his gaze. "So? Close the door. We are not to be disturbed." Julian's focus never left Elena. "And cancel my appointments for the rest of the day." Leo's eyebrows raised a fraction of an inch, the only sign of his surprise. Julian Thorne did not cancel appointments. Wars had been started for less. But he simply nodded. "Yes, sir." The heavy study door clicked shut, sealing the 3 of them inside. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the girl's shallow breathing. Julian gestured to one of the leather armchairs that faced his desk. "Sit down." She hesitated, looking from the chair to his face as if he had asked her to defuse a bomb. "Sit," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She practically fell into the chair, her small frame swallowed by the rich leather. She kept her hand clamped over the locket, a desperate shield against the imposing man before her. Julian walked back to the safe and carefully removed the faded photograph. He closed the safe, spun the dial, and moved the painting back into place. The wall was once again a bland seascape. The secrets were hidden, all except the one that now sat trembling in his study. He sat behind his desk, the photograph in his hand. He did not look at it. He looked at her. "Your name is Elena," he stated. It was not a question. He made it his business to know everyone who entered his home. She nodded, unable to speak. "You said the locket was your mother's," he continued, his voice softer now, less of a weapon. "Tell me about her." A flicker of something, pain, love, loss, crossed her face. She was a good woman. She worked hard. She raised me on her own. Where is she now? Elena's gaze dropped to her lap. She is sick. She is in a special care facility upstate. It is very expensive. Her voice was a monotone, a story recited so many times it had lost its emotional edges. I work to pay for it. What is her name? Julian asked, his heart beginning to beat a heavy, painful rhythm against his ribs. Her name is Anna, the girl whispered. Not Amelia. A wave of something akin to disappointment washed over him. He had been a fool, chasing a ghost in a piece of silver. It was just a coincidence. A cruel, meaningless coincidence. But his instincts, honed over a lifetime of navigating treachery, screamed at him. Coincidences were lies you told yourself to avoid a harder truth. This facility, he pressed. What is it called? I do not know, she stammered. A man handles the arrangements. I just give him the money every week. Julian's entire body went still. Very still. The quiet hum of the room's air filtration system sounded like a roaring engine. A man, he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. What man? Mr. Vance, she said, the name spoken with a mixture of fear and obligation. Marcus Vance. He was a friend of my mother's. He said he would take care of everything when she got sick. He found me this job. He finds me all my jobs. He takes most of the money for my mother's care. Vance. Marcus Vance. The name was a lit fuse dropped into the gunpowder of Julian's past. A snake. A bottom feeder who dealt in misery and preyed on the weak. They had been rivals decades ago, when Julian was still building his empire. Vance lacked any code, any honor. He dealt in human trafficking, extortion of the desperate, things Julian considered beneath even a man like himself. He had run Vance out of the city, or so he had thought. And Vance had known Amelia. They had moved in some of the same circles before. The pieces were no longer just falling into place. They were slamming together with the force of a tectonic collision. Julian placed the old photograph on the desk, turning it to face her. Have you ever seen this woman? He asked. Elena leaned forward hesitantly. Her eyes widened as she looked at the smiling girl on the pier. She stared for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. I am not sure, she said slowly. She looks familiar. Like a dream I cannot quite remember. She looked up at Julian, her confusion warring with her fear. Who is she? She was my sister, Julian said, the words tasting like ash. Her name was Amelia. He watched her face for a reaction, for any sign of recognition. There was nothing. Just a deep, empathetic sadness for the stranger in the photograph. He pushed a little harder. The locket she is wearing. Look closely. Elena's eyes went back to the picture, then down to the locket she was still clutching in her hand. She unclenched her fist, her thumb tracing the etched rose. It is the same, she breathed, a look of awe on her face. How is that possible? That is what I intend to find out, Julian said. He leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. Elena. Does your locket open? She nodded, her fingers fumbling with the tiny clasp. She worked at it for a moment before it sprang open. She held it out for him to see. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, faded picture of a baby, wrapped in a simple white blanket. On the other side, the smooth silver was empty. That is me, she said softly. My mother told me she put my picture in it the day I was born. Julian's mind was a maelstrom. Amelia had been pregnant when she disappeared. The family had kept it quiet, a deep source of shame for his traditional parents. But Julian had known. He had been the only one she had confided in. The father was some boy she refused to name, a boy who had broken her heart and vanished. A sick mother named Anna. A cruel coincidence of a locket. A predatory handler named Marcus Vance. A baby picture. It was a puzzle crafted by a devil. He had to see it through. He had to know. The decision solidified in his mind, not as a choice, but as an inevitability. For 35 years, he had been a king ruling an empire of shadows. He had power, wealth, and fear in equal measure. But none of it had ever bought him a single moment of peace regarding his sister. He had all the power he had once craved, the power to get answers. And now, a terrified girl in a grey uniform had just handed him the question. He remembered that day on the pier. He had taken the photograph himself with a cheap camera. "Stop being so serious, Jules," Amelia had laughed, the wind whipping strands of her dark hair across her face. "It's just a picture." He remembered adjusting the locket for her, the silver cool against his fingertips. "It's not just a locket," he had told her, his 19-year-old self full of clumsy solemnity. "It's a promise. I'll always be here to protect you. A promise." The memory was a ghost that had haunted his every success. It whispered to him in the quiet moments, in the space between breaths. "You failed her. You have all this power, and you failed the one person who mattered." He looked at Elena. At her sister's eyes. At the locket that was his promise made manifest. No. Not again. He would not fail again. He stood up, the movement decisive. Elena flinched back in her chair. "You will stay here," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "You will not leave this room. Leah will bring you food. You are not a cleaner anymore. You are a guest. Do you understand?" She could only nod, her eyes wide with bewilderment. Julian turned to the door, his mind already shifting from the past to the present, from grief to strategy. Marcus Vance. A ghost from his own past, now tangled with the ghost of his sister. It was time to exorcise them both. He opened the study door. Leo was waiting, his expression impassive, but his eyes were sharp, analytical. He had heard the name Vance through the door. He knew what that name meant. "Leo," Julian said, his voice dropping to the low, lethal tone reserved for business. "Get the team. Find everything you can on Marcus Vance. His current location, his operations, his weaknesses. I want to know where he sleeps, where he eats, what he breathes. I want to own him by midnight." Leo nodded once. No questions. No hesitation. He knew this was different. This was not about territory or money. The look in his boss's eyes was one he had not seen before. It was the look of a man about to burn down the world to find a single, lost thing. "And Leo," Julian added, pausing in the doorway. "So, find out the name of every long-term care facility within a 500-mile radius. I want a list of every patient named Anna who was admitted in the last 30 years." He paused, the next words heavy with a hope he had long thought buried. "And cross-reference it with any patient admitted under the name Amelia Thorne." The order hung in the air, thick with unspoken history. This was no longer about a coincidence. It was a reckoning. Julian Thorne was going to war, not for his empire, but for his family. He walked out of the study, leaving a stunned Leo and a terrified girl in his wake. The calm, controlled king was gone. In his place was the 19-year-old boy who had made a promise on a sunlit pier, now armed with 35 years of power and rage. The plan was simple. Brutally simple. Julian did not deal in complex strategies when the objective was personal. Subtlety was for business rivals and political puppets. This was about blood. This was about a debt 35 years overdue. He sat in the back of a black, armored sedan, the city lights blurring past the tinted windows. Leo sat opposite him, reading from a tablet, his voice a low, steady drone that cut through the engine's hum. Marcus Vance operates out of a warehouse in the industrial district. Nominally, it's a logistics company. In reality, it's the hub for his loan sharking operation. He preys on the desperate. Immigrants, single mothers, people with medical debt. He traps them in cycles of payment they can never escape. Julian stared out the window, his jaw tight. It was Vance's signature. Profiting from misery. He has a small crew, Leo continued. Thugs, not soldiers. 6 of them are at the warehouse tonight. Vance is there himself. He likes to be hands-on with his collections. And the girl's mother? Julian asked, his voice flat. Leo swiped a finger across the screen. That was harder. No woman named Anna or Amelia matching the profile was admitted to any official facility. Vance is hiding her. We're running a trace on his properties now, but the fastest way to find her is to ask him. We'll ask him, Julian confirmed. The car slowed, turning down a dark, potholed street lined with derelict buildings. At the end of the block was a large, corrugated metal warehouse, a few weak lights casting sickly yellow pools on the cracked asphalt. 2 men stood by the main entrance, smoking, their postures lazy but their eyes constantly scanning. 2 other sedans, identical to Julian's, pulled up silently behind them, their headlights off. 6 men, including Leo, were his team. They were not street muscle. They were quiet professionals, men who had seen conflict in far-flung places, now bound by loyalty and a generous salary to Julian Thorne. The front entrance is reinforced, Leo noted. There's a loading bay on the north side. Lighter security. We go through there. Fast and quiet. Julian shook his head. No, he said. We go through the front. Leo looked at him, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Sir, it will be louder. Messier. Good, Julian replied, his hand resting on the handle of the car door. I want him to hear us coming. This was not a surgical strike. It was a declaration. The doors of the 3 sedans opened in perfect unison. Julian stepped out into the damp night air, the scent of rain and rust filling his lungs. He did not wear a weapon. His presence was the weapon. The 2 lookouts by the door saw them. They straightened up, dropping their cigarettes. One reached inside his jacket. He never made it. One of Julian's men moved with liquid speed, closing the distance and disabling the man with 2 precise, brutal strikes. The other lookout raised his hands, his eyes wide with the sudden realization that he was catastrophically out of his league. Leo disarmed him and neutralized him with cold efficiency. It took less than 5 seconds. Julian walked past them without a glance and stood before the reinforced steel door. One of his men produced a small, specialized breaching charge. I want him alive, Leo, Julian said quietly. But I don't care in how many pieces. The charge was placed. A soft, muffled thump and the lock mechanism shattered. Julian pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the warehouse was vast and dimly lit. Racks of empty shelves stood like skeletal remains. In the center of the floor, a circle of harsh light from an overhead lamp illuminated a small office built from particle board and cheap glass. Inside, 4 men were gathered around a table, laughing. One of them, a man with slicked-back grey hair and a cheap suit, was Marcus Vance. He looked up as the door groaned open, his laughter dying in his throat. His eyes widened, first in confusion, then in dawning horror as he recognized the figure stepping out of the shadows. Thorne? Vance breathed, disbelief warring with terror. His men scrambled for their weapons, but it was too late. Julian's team flowed into the room behind him, moving with the silent, coordinated grace of predators. The confrontation was short, one-sided, and brutal. It was over before Vance could even get out of his chair. His 4 thugs were on the floor, groaning and incapacitated. Julian walked slowly towards the office, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He stopped in the doorway, his large frame filling it completely. His men secured the perimeter, their work done. This was between their boss and the man in the chair. Vance was pale, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. He tried to project an air of bravado, but his trembling hands gave him away. "Thorne," he said, his voice a strained croak. "To what do I owe the pleasure? This is a little outside your usual territory, isn't it?" Julian said nothing. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the heart-shaped locket. He let it swing gently from its chain, the silver catching the harsh light. Vance's eyes fixed on it. The last of his manufactured courage drained from his face, replaced by a stark, primal fear. He knew what it was. He knew what it meant. "Where did you get that?" he stammered. "From my niece," Julian said, the words precise and cold. "A girl named Elena. She works as a maid to pay off a debt to you. A debt for her mother's care." He took another step into the office, his shadow falling over Vance. "You remember my sister, don't you, Marcus?" Julian's voice was a low whisper now, but it carried more menace than any shout. "Amelia. You always had a talent for finding the vulnerable ones." Vance shook his head, trying to deny it. "I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't seen Amelia in decades." "Liar," Julian hissed. He was across the room in an instant, his hand grabbing the front of Vance's cheap suit and hauling him out of his chair. Vance's feet dangled inches from the floor. "She had a baby, Marcus," Julian snarled, his face inches from Vance's. "My niece. You took them both. You hid my sister away, told her daughter she was sick, and turned the girl into your personal slave to pay for the care you were providing. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. You didn't just steal her life," Julian continued, his grip tightening. "You monetised her suffering. You fed a daughter lies and a mother poison, and you called it business." Terror finally broke through Vance's defenses. "It wasn't like that," he gasped. "She came to me. She was scared, alone. I helped her. I gave her a new life, a new name. I protected her." "You protected her." Julian's laugh was a harsh, ugly sound. "You caged her. You broke her spirit and held her daughter's life over her head to keep her compliant. You didn't protect her, Marcus. You buried her alive." He slammed Vance back against the wall, the particle board groaning in protest. "This is your last chance," Julian said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Where is she? Where is my sister?" Vance was sobbing now, tears and sweat mixing on his terrified face. "A farmhouse," he choked out. "Upstate. Off Route 9. It's isolated. No one ever goes there." He gave the address, the words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. Julian held him there for a long moment, searching his eyes for any hint of deception. He found only the pathetic, all-consuming fear of a man who knew his life was over. He released his grip. Vance slumped to the floor, a boneless heap of cheap fabric and shattered bravado. Julian turned to Leo, who was standing in the doorway. "You have the address," Julian said. "Take 2 men. Go get her. Bring her home." Leo nodded. "And him?" he asked, jerking his chin towards the whimpering man on the floor. Julian looked down at Marcus Vance one last time. He saw not a rival, but a parasite. A creature that fed on the pain of others. A violation of every code, both legitimate and illegitimate. There was no place in the world for a man like that. "The problem of Marcus Vance," Julian said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "is now permanently closed." He turned and walked out of the office, not looking back. He did not need to. He knew Leo would handle the finality of the situation with his usual quiet professionalism. As he stepped back out into the cool night air, Julian Thorne did not feel the triumph of victory. He did not feel the satisfaction of revenge. He felt only the hollow ache of 35 years of silence, and a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope that it was finally about to be broken. He had found the question. Now, he was about to face the answer. The drive to the farmhouse was the longest of Julian's life. Leo had confirmed it. A woman matching Amelia's description was there, living under the name Anna. She was the only occupant, cared for by a rotating staff paid by Vance to keep her isolated and medicated. They were on their way to retrieve her. Julian had gone back to the penthouse. To wait. To face Elena. He found her in the study, curled up in the large armchair, asleep. A plate of untouched food sat on the table beside her. She looked impossibly young, impossibly fragile. She looked like a victim. He would not allow her to be a victim for one moment longer. He sat at his desk and waited. The hours crawled by. The city outside grew quiet. The amber liquid in his glass remained untouched. He did nothing but watch the slow rise and fall of the sleeping girl's chest. What would he say to her? How could he possibly explain the last 35 years? How could he introduce a mother she thought was sick to a world she never knew existed? How could he explain the violence he had just unleashed to secure her future? A soft buzz from his phone broke the silence. It was Leo. "We have her, sir. She's safe. She's confused. But she's safe." Julian closed his eyes, a breath he didn't realize he was holding escaping his lips. "Bring her here. We're 20 minutes out. 20 minutes. He stood and walked over to the armchair. He gently touched Elena's shoulder. She started, her eyes flying open, wide with fear before they focused on him. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer than he thought possible. "You are safe." "What is happening?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep and confusion. "Where is Mr. Vance?" "Mr. Vance will no longer be bothering you. Or anyone else," Julian said simply. "Your debt is gone. You are free." She stared at him, trying to process the words. Freedom was a concept so foreign to her it had no meaning. "My mother," she said, her voice rising with panic. "Her care, who will pay for her care?" "Her care has been handled," Julian said. He took a deep breath. "Elena. What you were told about your mother, it was not the truth. She was not sick. She was a prisoner." Elena shook her head, a look of profound disbelief on her face. "No. That's not possible. She. Vance lied to you," Julian said, his voice firm but gentle. "He lied about everything. He kept you apart. He used you." The sound of the private elevator arriving at the penthouse floor echoed softly through the apartment. "Your mother is here," Julian said. "She is coming home." He helped Elena to her feet just as Leo appeared in the doorway of the study. He stepped aside, and a woman walked hesitantly into the room. She was older, her hair streaked with grey, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond years. She was thinner than in the photograph, and the light in her eyes was dimmed, but it was her. It was Amelia. Her eyes scanned the opulent room, confused, scared. Then they landed on Elena. Time stopped. "Elena," she whispered, the name a fragile prayer. Elena stared, her mind struggling to reconcile the woman she visited in a sterile, medicated haze once a month with the woman standing before her now. But then she saw it. In the eyes. The same eyes that looked back at her from the mirror. "Mama," she breathed. They moved towards each other, slowly at first, then collapsing into an embrace that was 35 years in the making. Sobs racked their bodies, a storm of grief and relief and questions that had no words. Julian stood back, a silent observer of the reunion he had both caused and corrected. He felt a profound sense of rightness, a closing of a circle that had been left open for far too long. He had kept his promise. It was late, but it was kept. He saw his sister, Amelia, look up from her daughter's shoulder. Her eyes met his across the room. Recognition dawned slowly, fighting through a fog of memory and trauma. "Jules," she whispered, her voice cracking. He could only nod, his throat tight with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. Later, after the tears had subsided, they sat together. Amelia and Elena on the sofa, hands clasped tightly, never letting go. Julian sat in the armchair opposite them. He had explained everything. The lies of Vance. The prison disguised as a clinic. The debt that was nothing more than a chain. Elena looked at him, her young face a canvas of conflicting emotions. She had been saved by this terrifying, powerful man. This man who was her uncle. She reached into the small purse she always carried and pulled out a crumpled envelope. It was filled with cash. Her meager savings. "This is all I have," she said, her voice trembling as she held it out to him. "It's not much, but thank you. For my mother." Julian looked at the envelope, then at her earnest, tear-streaked face. He gently pushed her hand back. "Keep your money, Elena," he said softly. "You gave me something tonight worth more than all the money in this city. You gave me my family back." He looked from her to his sister, seeing the resemblance so clearly now. The shared strength. The shared history of survival. Elena pulled her hand back, her brow furrowed. She was trying to understand him, to place him in a world that had, until today, been composed of only good people who suffered and bad people who prospered. He did not fit. "What are you?" she asked, the question genuine, born of a deep confusion. "Are you a bad man?" Julian looked at his sister, whose life had been stolen. He looked at his niece, whose life had been indentured. He thought of Marcus Vance, a stain removed from the world. Was it a bad act? He did not think so. It was a necessary one. He met Elena's gaze, his own eyes clear and steady. "I am what my family needs me to be," he answered. The answer seemed to satisfy her. It was not an excuse or a justification. It was a statement of purpose. He stood and walked to his desk, retrieving a simple, black business card. There was no name on it, no company. Just a single phone number. He handed it to Elena. "You will never be in debt again," he said, his voice a vow. "You and your mother will want for nothing. You will be safe. I promise you that." He tapped the card. "You call this number if the wind blows the wrong way. If a shadow looks at you too long. If you have a bad dream. Do you understand?" She took the card, her fingers closing around it as if it were a holy relic. She nodded, speechless. For the first time in 35 years, Julian Thorne's world felt complete. The ghosts had been laid to rest. The wound had finally begun to heal. 1 year later. The penthouse was different. It was no longer a silent monument to power and isolation. It was a home. The sound of laughter often echoed in the hallways. Amelia was healing. It was a slow process, a careful reconstruction of a life that had been put on hold. She had good days and bad days, but every day, she had her daughter and her brother. She was rediscovering the woman she was supposed to be. Elena was thriving. She was enrolled in a local university, studying to be a nurse. The tiredness was gone from her eyes, replaced by the bright, curious spark of youth. She was free, and she wore her freedom with a quiet, radiant grace. On Sunday evenings, they had dinner together in the main dining room. Julian, Amelia, and Elena. Leah would sometimes join them, his stoic presence a familiar comfort. Tonight, they were celebrating. Elena had aced her midterm exams. "I told you she had your brains, Jules," Amelia said, teasing her brother. Julian allowed a rare smile to grace his lips. "She has your mother's heart. That is more important." He watched them, his sister and his niece, their bond deepening with every passing day. They were a testament to resilience, a living embodiment of hope. Later that evening, after they had retired, Julian found himself in his study. The room was the same, but the feeling was entirely different. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a lingering warmth. He walked to the wall and moved the painting of the seascape aside. He opened the safe. The hidden compartment at the back was still there. But the old, faded photograph of a girl on a pier was gone. He had given it to Amelia. In its place was a new photograph, in a simple silver frame. It was taken last week, in the penthouse's small garden. Julian stood in the middle, with Amelia on one side and Elena on the other. They were all smiling. It was not a posed smile, but a genuine, unguarded expression of happiness. Around Elena's neck, the heart-shaped locket was clearly visible. He traced the glass over their faces with his finger. For most of his life, he had measured his worth in power, in territory, in the fear he commanded. He had built an empire of shadows to protect himself from the powerlessness he had felt as a young man. But he had been wrong. True power was not the ability to destroy one's enemies. It was the strength to protect one's family. True wealth was not held in bank vaults, but in moments of shared laughter around a dinner table. He had spent a lifetime chasing a throne only to find that his real kingdom was contained in this small, silver frame. He had not become a good man. The world was too complicated for such simple labels. But he had been given a chance to do a good thing. And in the end, perhaps that was all that mattered. Not what you were, but what you chose to do with the power you had. It was a lesson that had cost him 35 years to learn, a lesson brought to him by a quiet maid with his sister's eyes. A lesson he would never forget.